beautiful people. Welcome to another exciting session of BYJU'S Social Science classes. So things are exciting all around. Before I actually head into what we're going to do today, well, I want to tell you a little bit about ANTHE. You probably already know that ANTHE is the Akash National Talent Hunt exam, and it is a great opportunity for you to register for this, because this registration is absolutely free, and there are so many benefits of actually appearing for this exam. So click on the link in your description box and go and register, because it is free, it costs nothing. And apart from this, I want to tell you that we have midterm mania coming up, right? Midterms are just around the corner. But we at BYJU'S have you covered as always, because we have mission midterm. So this has already started, but basically it's our way of gearing you up and preparing you for doing the best that you can during your midterms. So you're going to have a lot of benefits for this. You're going to have chapter revision notes. We're going to be doing exam focused important questions. We're going to have a lot of one-shot marathons. We're going to do doubt solving strategy classes. We will be having even mock tests that we will do for you. So basically, like I said, we're going to gear you up. And hey, in terms of social science, I will be putting up some shorts for you also, which will definitely help you, right? And this is all apart from the sessions that we already do for you over here. So without any further ado, let's talk about today's session. Today we are going to continue with our history lesson for grade 8, which is how, when, and where. Now, you know that we did a session for you last time, right? So let's quickly recap what we learned in the first part of this chapter, which was how, when, and where. So in the previous session, we learned what is history. Then we learned why should we study history and what will happen if we do not study it. We also looked at how we study history and is there any particular methodology to be followed, and we understood a little bit more about periodization. So basically last time, if you remember, I had covered the 5W1H formula, right? So just in case you haven't attended the last session, you can always find this session on our 6th to 8th channel. So please go ahead, view it. It will be a very, very good thing for you to do, because it will form a link between what we've done last time and what we are going to do today, right? Okay, so today we will be learning the other 3W questions from the 5W1H formula. That is, we will be talking about who has written history, when did history occur, and is there any particular time period that we should study about or focus on. And we will also be studying where do we study history from. So let's start with our fourth question, which is who has written history, or in other words, who does the periodization of history, right? So you tell me, what do you think? Well, actually the answer is very, very simple. Who has written history, or who does the periodization of the history? Well, it is the historians. Who are these historians? Well, they are people who specialize in the study of history. And what do? They basically collect and evaluate information from many sources to understand or answer questions about historical events, right? So this is about who has written history. Now let's move on to our next question, or our fifth question, which is when did history occur, and is there any particular time period that we should study about or focus on? Okay, so to understand this question, let's first talk about some historians. Now, actually, speaking of historians, there was one particular historian who was of special interest. His name was James Mill, and he was a Scottish economist and a political philosopher. But why was he so important? Why was he of special interest? Well, James Mill is the first British historian to use periodization for Indian history. Now that's quite cool, right? Well, it is, but there is a catch here. his classification was used as an example to show how one should, not do periodization. Why? Well, to understand that, let's take a look at his classification. So basically, James Mill, in his massive 3-volume work, which was called A History of British India, he periodized Indian history into 3 periods, which were namely the Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the British period, as we have on screen over here. Now, the Hindu period refers to the period under the rule of Hindu kings. The Muslim period, correspondingly, refers to the period under the rule of Muslim kings. And the British period then obviously refers to the period under the rule of the British. But this kind of classification actually had some issues. It was not at all, in fact, an accurate representation of Indian society at that particular time. In fact, it was quite a narrow classification which was based on religion only. Mill thought that all Asian societies were at a lower level of civilization than Europe. Can you believe that? And according to his telling of history, before the British came to India, Hindu and Muslim despots ruled the country. And at this time, there was a lot of religious intolerance, there was caste taboos, there were superstitious practices which dominated all of social life. And Mill felt that British rule could actually civilize India. And so, to do this, it was very necessary to introduce European manners, arts, institutions, and laws to India. In fact, Mill suggested that the British should conquer all the territories in India to ensure the enlightenment and the happiness of the Indian people. Can you believe that? Now, this is basically because he thought that India was not capable of progress without the help of the British. And in this idea of history, the British rule represented all the forces of progress and civilization, and the period before the British rule was one of darkness. Unimaginable, right? So, coming back, the question that we need to ask here is whether we can actually refer to any period of history as specifically Hindu or Muslim. I mean, did we not have a variety of faiths that existed simultaneously in these periods? Why should we characterize an age only through the religion of the rulers of the time? So, basically, if we are doing so, we are suggesting that the lives and practices of others do not really matter, right? And apart from this, we should also actually remember that even if you take the rulers in ancient India, they did not all share the same faith, right? And so this is exactly why there was a very important need for another classification of history. So, keeping this need in mind, after Mill, we had a few historians that divided Indian history into 3 periods again. But unlike Mill's division, this was not based on religion. So, they classified Indian history into the ancient period, then we had the medieval period, and then we had the modern period. Now, the ancient period, according to these historians, they referred to the start of civilizations, whereas the medieval period referred to the dark ages because of the ignorance of people. Like, people didn't seem to know much at that point in time, right? And the modern period, on the other hand, was associated with very modern ideas and ideas of transformations, basically, right? So, what do you think? Based on this, do you think that this classification was accepted without any problem? No, naturally not, because many historians actually, they did not agree with this division also. Can you tell me why? Well, if you think about it or if you look at it closely, you will find that the Indian civilization did not actually advance chronologically. For example, if you take the period between 4th to 6th CE. Now, this is known as the golden age of India due to considerable achievements of Indians in the fields of actually so many fields. We had fields of mathematics, astronomy, science, religion, philosophy, and all of this was happening at this period during the Gupta Empire. But if we go by the classification made by the historians, then we would have to say that this beautiful golden age or the Gupta age falls under the ancient period, and according to them this would be the start of civilization, and so there would be no developments that were possible before the advent of the modern period. And obviously this is not true, right? So this example also proves that the periodization by other historians also had problems, right? Why? Because generally when we talk about modern period, we are talking about growth of science, growth of technology. We're also talking about freedom. We're talking about liberty. We're talking about equality of the citizens of that particular society. But if you think about it, during the rule of the Britishers, there were no such rights that were given to the Indian citizens. In fact, on the contrary, they were forced by the Britishers to give up on their land. They had to pay really, really high taxes. So there was a lot of poverty. And at that point in time, actually, the British were taking away all the resources and the wealth from India. So actually, many historians will treat this period as not as a modern period, but they will treat this as a colonial period, not a modern period with ideas and transformations, because at that point it was not possible for this to be there for Indian society with the British rule, right? So this was a colonial period. Now, what exactly is a colonial period? Any guesses? Well, to understand the colonial period, let us go back a few hundred years when the British came to conquer and establish their rule over India. Now, they established control over the economy and society, and they collected revenues to meet all their expenses, and they bought goods at a much lower rate, and they produced crops that they wanted to export. Right? So you see, this was all for their benefit, and this resulted obviously in many changes in the customs, in the values, in the practices of the Indians who were living at that point in time. So if we have to define colonization, we can say that when the subjugation of one country by another leads to these kind of political, economic, social and cultural changes, basically we can refer to this process as colonization, right? And this period would then be referred to as a colonial period. Okay, great. So, by now we have learned about periodization and classification. Now, let us move on to the next question. That is, where did the historians study history from? So, historians used different sources to talk about what happened in the past in our country, including in the colonial period. Doesn't it sound interesting? Well, actually, to make it even more exciting and interesting for you, take a look at what I've got for you here on the screen. Can you see this over here? Do you know what it is? Well, this is a source belonging to the colonial period, and this was maintained by the British, and through this document actually we are able to study or know about what happened at that point in time. So, what do you think these records were called? I'm sure they had a name for these, right? Well, the name for such documents was official records, and examples of such official records would include things like letters, memos, agreements, plans, investigations, policies, etc. And all of these have acted as sources of information for any historian to write or study about the past, right? Okay, now let me draw your attention to the year in which this source was recorded. Can you tell me the date? Well, actually, it was in 1946. That is 76 years ago. So can you tell me, how did a record like this survive for 76 years? Well, that's because it was preserved with great care. Now, can you tell me who preserved it? Well, actually, this was preserved by our government. In fact, this practice of preserving the document actually came from the British. So they used to build huge record rooms for documents such as these, and they used offices of tehsildars, commissioners and law courts for this very purpose. And this process of preserving documents is known as archiving, and the places in which these documents were kept were known as archives. So interesting. And by the way, the National Archives of India, which was built in the 1920s, is actually one example of one such place. Basically, it's very cool, right? Because how would we know? There's so many documents over here. It's a great place to go and check out stuff. But actually, talking about preserving documents, would writing down and preserving documents really help when you have, I mean, what I'm talking about is, would only writing down and preserving documents really help when you have such a large empire to rule? Or would you need something else? No, obviously not, right? The Britishers had to do something extra to ensure that they made the correct decisions when ruling and administering a foreign country, right? They needed something extra apart from documenting and preserving these documents. So, what were their intentions actually? Now, if you think of it from the British point of view, there were two intentions over here. The first was to understand the country that they were ruling. This is very, very important. To rule anything, you have to understand it, right? Know more about it. And the second, from their point of view, would be to understand or know more about the resources that were available to them, so that then they could go and exploit them for their use. So, keeping this in mind, what did the Britishers do? Well, they traveled to the far corners of India and they conducted some exercises to record different aspects of India. Now, do you know what these exercises were called? Well, I know you know. These exercises were called surveys. And surveys were considered a very important source of colonial history. So, how do surveys help us to know more about our colonial history? Well, actually, we can get a lot of information from the surveys that were conducted by the Britishers. These surveys were conducted for the following reasons. First of all, to map out India, which means to understand more about their territory. To go ahead and understand more about the soil quality, right? Because they had to check for the suitability of crops, and eventually this would give them back their profits. It was more to understand the flora and fauna in the territories, to know more about the local histories, right? So this was the need for surveys. Now, apart from this, they also conducted a census alongside the surveys. So, can you tell me what a census is? Yes, we have heard the name before. Let me explain this. A census is a procedure to collect information about the population. So these censuses were actually the first to take place in India, and actually till this date it is conducted in our country, taking a cue from the work done by the British, and they are actually very helpful, right? So this is about official records. But talking about official records, do official records tell us about the complete history of India during the colonial period? Do you remember that earlier we studied that history depends on the perspective of the people who are looking at it, right? So obviously, if we go through, say, the official records of the Britishers, do you think that we're going to know the complete history of our country? No, we won't, because it was recorded from their perspective and has a high chance of being biased. And that is why these sources were not sufficient to serve as a source to know the accurate or the reliable history of India. You needed more, right? So even though we do get a good amount of information from these sources, in order to know actually what the Indians felt in terms of their, at that time, what were they feeling? What were their actions? What were their decisions, right? So for these things, we need to look for other sources, as their lives, the Indians' lives, were not covered in these official records. So what are the sources required to understand what the people in the country felt, and what were the ideas that lay behind their actions? Well, we need other sort of sources. And these sources would be things like the diaries of people, autobiographies. You could have even very interesting accounts of pilgrims and travelers because they saw so much, right? You had popular booklets at that point in time, newspapers. You had the ideas of leaders, poets, and social reformers of that point in time. So all their ideas you would find in these kind of records, and all these kind of sources of information are known as unofficial sources or unofficial records. Now, why do you think they're called unofficial records? Well, that's because they were not officially written by the British officials, and the British were the ones who were ruling India at that point in time, right? So this is the unofficial sources. So basically, to understand history, you have the help of the official sources as well as additionally the unofficial sources, which will give us the entire picture, right? Okay, so with that, we've pretty much reached the end of this chapter. Very interesting chapter. Let us quickly summarize all the concepts that we have learned in this chapter. So we did the whole 5W1H formula, which helped us to understand this chapter a little bit earlier. Not earlier, a little bit better or easier. So what was our first question? We started with, what is history? What is history? Well, history is about tracing changes over a period of time. Then we asked, why should we study history? Right? So why should we study history? Well, obviously studying history will help us to understand the changes that have occurred over time and will help us to even understand our lives better. How do we study history was our next question. Well, we can study history with the help of periodization, and with this it will actually become easier. But we also learned that there are certain ways that we can periodize, and definitely there are certain ways that we cannot, right? Then the fourth question that we talked about was, who has written history? And of course we said that the historians of course have written history, right? Then we went and we spoke about, when did history occur? Well, in this chapter, we have specifically looked into the colonial period of our country, right, in terms of history. And finally, we asked, where do we study history from? And we said that we study history from sources, and these sources could be both official as well as unofficial sources. Now, before I end this chapter or end this session, I actually have a question for you. Ta-da! What is your question? Well, the question is, can you think of examples of surveys in our world today? Think about it and let me know your answers in the comment section below. I will eagerly be waiting for your answers. Now, before I end, I want to tell you that I have some very exciting news for you. So I started with exciting news and then I'm ending with exciting news. The exciting news is that in terms of our BYJU'S mini learning program, we have the program free for the first 1,000 users every week. So please click on the link in your description box, type in the code YTFIRST and avail of this program absolutely free. Isn't that exciting? For more such sessions, tune into BYJU'S 6th to 8th channel. We're always here with you, always giving you more and more. And definitely do not forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel. I'm going to see you really soon. Bye-bye.